Today's topic is AIVRS case management practices. And I just want to start out by saying today's presentation or ideas that we are presenting to you, these are best practices for case management, especially in the AIVRS community. And so these are suggestions that we are making. It's not mandatory. Everyone does their case management in different ways. Offices have different practices and processes for case management, but what we're presenting today are some ideas and tips and information that we feel like would be beneficial to you. First, I want to start out with a definition of case management. It is defined basically by a collaborative process that assesses, plans, implements, coordinates, monitors, and evaluates the options and services required to meet a participant's health and human services need. So basically, at the core of case management, we're looking at transforming individuals' lives through individualized case management, case planning, assessment, and other areas of service. Next slide, please. Our learning objectives today are to learn more about effective strategies for case management, developing culturally responsive intake practices, creating and managing case files in a productive manner, and increasing, hopefully, productivity and employment outcomes in your caseload. Okay, so today's presentation is broken down into 4 areas of case management. Number 1, intake, 2, needs assessment, 3, service planning, and 4, monitoring and evaluation. Onita is going to start us off with the intake portion of today's presentation. And Onita, at this time, if you want to give our attendees a little more information about yourself, if you would like to introduce yourself or anything, please feel free to do so. Next slide.
Right. Thank you, Jamie. Let me start off by saying good morning to some and good afternoon to others. For me in particular, it's afternoon. Let me thank you all for taking the time to sign up for this webinar. And I am just happy to be included in this process, and hopefully I can share something, whether it's my own experiences or something from the slide that may assist someone that's signed in today. So I'm sorry, the next slide, 7. So I am a counselor with the United Houma Nation Vocational Rehabilitation Services Program here, and the main office is located in Houma, Louisiana. But as you all know, due to, some of you may not know, due to Hurricane Ida, there's been some challenges. So right now I am temporarily working out of our office in Marrero. Marrero is located about 15 minutes from New Orleans. So I'm out in the city right now, but it's all working out. So prayers for that. In the meantime, let's get into the meat and potatoes of why we all came in. That's enough about me. So intake. So we all have become employees of vocational rehabilitation programs. We're all excited. We've been trained, and in some cases, we may have just been thrown into our position, because sometimes that's some people's story. But so intake is pretty much, we're in place, and that is our first contact, our initial meeting with an applicant for the voc rehab program. In some cases, some individuals might sign up for voc rehab because they have this idea of what they think voc rehab may be, or in some cases they may hear, oh, they pay for you to go to college, so I'm going to sign up for that. So they may not necessarily know that it's an employment-based program, that the goal is employment. And so then they come to you, and then they go to orientation. Some programs may do orientation separately and apart from that initial appointment, but they have an idea of what voc rehab is, but they may not necessarily know. So that initial meeting is the opportunity for counselors or rehab techs or whoever to find out exactly what services that person may desire, if they really are in need of voc rehab services, if they qualify for voc rehab services, and if perhaps they may not be in a place where they are ready to become gainfully employed or maintain employment. And so that's our opportunity to find out those things. What's needed, can we help them, and how can we help them? And that is also an opportunity to find out what type of barriers may be present. And in some cases, we may have to refer a person out at this point to address those barriers, because those barriers may hinder them from being able to move forward with the vocational rehabilitation process. So that initial meeting is to gather information and to learn and to build rapport with the individual as you move toward voc rehab. And next slide, please. So in our initial intake interview, that's when we get together to complete an application. And like I said, the most important part about that is building rapport, because we want the person who is coming in. We do understand that vocational rehabilitation is a voluntary program, and that the people that are coming in, they're voluntarily coming in for our services. So, but we want to really engage them and have them be a part of our services. We don't want to make them feel like, we're here to tell you what you're going to do, and that's how this is going to go. So we really need to make sure we get the person engaged. So we really strive to build rapport with the person by asking the right questions, listening when they talk, and those type of things, which I'll discuss in a little bit more in detail. So of course, when we do that initial interview, we're asking the questions that are on our application, whatever your application may look like. Programs use different applications, and AIVRTTAC does have like an example of an application on their website that for reference. And some of the things we collect during that initial intake is like medical and psychological history. Because we are working with individuals with disabilities, so we need that information. Educational background, vocational interest, to see what kind of goals they may have, and if they're in line, and if they're feasible and reachable with their disabilities. Social and cultural background, which is very important because in tribal VR, culture plays a big part and how we interact with our applicants and our consumers. Legal records, if there are any legal issues to address, available financial resources, and health insurance. So all of that information plays a part in how we move forward with each applicant. And remembering that VR is individualized service, so everybody's services won't necessarily look like the next person's services. So next slide. So of course, the goal of the intake is to increase the applicant's understanding of what is vocational rehabilitation, right? What is the purpose of the program? How does it work? What are the policies and procedures for your particular program? Because once again, every program has their own set of policies and procedures, and making sure that the applicant understands the policies and procedures that are in place with your program and how the program works. And then of course, you talk about how was the person referred to the program, because we know sometimes referrals may come from community members, family members, doctor's offices, other agencies, other nonprofit organizations, sometimes maybe even drug courts and things like that. So it's important to know that the services that we provide, you discussed that, of course, the different types of services and how some of our services will address, cultural needs, and the rights and responsibilities of the applicant as they apply for services. That's very important to discuss, because the person needs to understand that they will be treated with the utmost respect, and that we will try to be honest in our involvement with them during that process, and also being able to be honest and upfront and share with them even the hard stuff that we sometimes struggle with discussing, or those conversations we sometimes struggle with having, but actually needing to be honest and transparent as much as possible without seeming like we're being mean or rude. Of course, the client assistance program is very important. That information has to be shared during the intake process and as you move forward, also during the development of IPE and those type things. And of course, establishing if they've ever applied for services with the state VR program, and if they have, what that joint collaboration may look like between tribal VR and state VR, and what is required of that participant to be able to have those joint services and things like that. So processes, policies, procedures, and those type things are all also discussed during the intake process. And next slide. So then we talk about how to conduct the intake meeting. There is no blanket answer for how to conduct the intake meeting, but just, you know, for references and just for suggestions. When you're conducting your intake meeting, that is your time to gather valuable information. And so that is at the time where you may have your applicant sign consent to release forms for medical records. And medical records includes physical health as well as mental health. And also that would be the time to establish if the person has been in care or not been in care, and then you have to refer them out for assessments and evaluations. You talk about their educational background and how far they've moved as far as in the educational system, whether they finished high school, dropped out, why they dropped out, those type things. Also, in talking about medical history, also discussing things like substance use, if there's a history of it, and finding out if they're in treatment, how long they've been clean, if they are in treatment, what type of treatment are they in, what type of care plan do they have. Some programs require a former substance user to be in a care plan once they become a part of the program. Legal records, whether they've been in trouble with the law, if so, what did that look like? Financial resources, whether they receive assistance, whether it's TANF, what we like to say, food stamps, scholarships, child support, any type of financial assistance they may be receiving, including from other family members as well. And then, of course, we explain in that process how a person becomes eligible for vocational rehabilitation services. We talk about confidentiality and the importance of confidentiality, them signing over consent to release forms to be able to get medical records and other records as well. And if they happen to share a case with the state, then of course signing a consent to release form with for the state VR program, so that you can be able to go back and forth with their case manager with the state and be able to have that information so that you can share with them and they can share with you in providing services for the applicant if the applicant is eligible for VR services. Next slide. Okay, so that's pretty much some of the stuff I've talked about. So during the application process, you're gonna fill out forms. They're gonna sign the forms. You're gonna sign forms. You might talk about vocational goals and what that may look like. You talk about the process. You let them know today, you know, we're filling out this application, but I'm going to gather this information. I'm going to gather your medical records, or we're going to send you out for evaluation. That information will be used to determine your eligibility. I like to explain to consumer applicants that, you know, VR is not what we call a quick fix. And, you know, it's more of a long-term process. It's more of a long process, and could be a slow process for some who are ready to go to work immediately. But I tell them, we like to look at what can we do to help you get to a career versus finding a job. And so you know, they need to understand that it may take up to 60 days for eligibility determination. And they need to understand that, you know, the IPE development, you know, we have up to so many days to do that. So they'll understand that it won't be, you know, like a bam, 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 and I'm working type process. You know, this is more this is the turtle versus the hare is what I like to tell them. Even when talking about setting goals and that type of thing, because depending on where they are in the process, you know, you may have to meet a few times before you even get into IPE development to establish vocational goals and that type thing. Because some people come in with the idea that, you know, I know what I want to do. And sometimes when you have conversations, you find out that that may not necessarily be what they want to do. And then it's very important to establish trust through rapport building and hospitality. So always being professional and being cordial and being empathetic versus sympathetic, and listening when someone speaks. And I do understand you have some people that come in and they like to talk. They talk a lot. And so, you know, getting them to stay focused sometimes is a challenge, but you don't want to ever be rude. So
Onita.
yeah, I see somebody has their hand raised. Yeah.
Yeah, Onita, it's Jamie who has her hand raised.
Hey, I just didn't I didn't want to break your train of thought or break in while you were right in the middle of a sentence. But I was thinking to myself when I was a VR counselor, and different offices have different styles of doing things. But I always did what I call, when I put it on my calendar for the meeting appointment time, I would say, I would save it as an orientation and intake meeting, because all of those things that you mentioned, you know, as far as like telling them about the program, what you do there, you know, a lot of people come to VR and don't really know what VR is all about. They think they do, but then when they get there, they kind of get surprised. So it's so important to kind of have that orientation session prior to your intake meeting, so that you know, because a lot of people, when you start talking about going to work, they say, oh, well, that wasn't, you know, what I come here for.
Exactly.
So you don't want to really waste their time or yours. So
And
at that point, at that point, they can either move into the application process, or they can, you know, elect not to. But thank you.
And I've even found, and you're right, because I've even found, like, we have in our program, we have the rehab tech of conducting orientation, right? And then they meet with us. And then when you start to talk about what the program does, then they're sitting there going, oh, well, yeah, I don't know. So even if they've gone through orientation already, sometimes you have to reorient them, you know, so they can really understand this is what this program does. Yeah, so that's a good point, Jamie. Thank you so much for clarifying that. And it's true. You know, sometimes you have to, well, most times during the application process, you are doing orientation again. I know that we do here in our program in particular. Thank you so much for that input. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about us for a minute, as counselors, rehab techs, whatever your job title is, and but working in the VR.
Onita, this is Rebecca. I just want to point out something that's in the chat box. Mary stated that VR is complex and orientation continues throughout. So thank you for sharing that, Mary.
Thank you, Mary. And Mary is absolutely correct. It is. And, you know, even if you've had someone who's been in the process in the program for over a year, sometimes you have to go back and reiterate how the program works, especially when you have someone that's not necessarily, you know, following the process and doing what needs to be done on their end, because we're going to run into that, right? Y'all know, for the even if you're new, you know, to the whole VR thing, you have some people that kind of like drag their heels and just getting them to move forward, and they're kind of stuck. So then you have to remind them, you know, this is how this process works. This is the policy on that. This is the procedure, you know, to try to get them moving forward. So thank you, Mary. All right, so awareness, being aware of our own experiences, values, and beliefs. How can one's bias affect case management? Guess what? It can, because we're human, just like the people we're serving, right? But sometimes different things like life experiences, values, and beliefs and prejudices can affect how we case manage. And when we talk about life experiences, we're talking about things like being divorced, getting divorced, being divorced, immigration, if someone moved here from another country and is now a counselor, chronic illness, just different things that happen in life, or death of a loved one, that's kind of left us in bereavement, to the point where we really feel like, I don't feel like working, or I don't feel like moving forward. We need to think about, like, how do our personal life experiences affect how we case manage and how we interact with other people? Our values and beliefs. How do you feel about substance users? How do we feel about reproductive rights? How do we feel about religion, sexuality? Those type things, because sometimes our values and beliefs may actually hinder or interfere with the way we may interact with certain people, or who we perceive certain people to be, which also leads to prejudices. So, how do we feel about certain groups? How do we feel about people who look a certain way, or who speak a certain way, or people who can't speak this or who can't do that? What triggers us I guess is the best way to say that, because sometimes our own triggers, or our own values, our own belief systems, or our own prejudices sometimes may affect how we engage in case management, so we need to be self-aware of who we are as people and how that affects how we interact with other people. Because we don't want to not be our whole selves and be effective in helping someone become their whole self, because we have an issue with their lifestyle or their former lifestyle, or things like that. So sometimes we have to take a look back at ourselves and see what it is about ourselves that that could hinder us from being the best case managers we can be. In communication style, when we talk about that, we're talking about being client-centered. And when we're client-centered, that allows us to be supportive in analyzing and identifying a realistic employment goal, and assisting in the IPE process when it comes to working in VR in particular. So we need to be able to, when I say big ears, big eyes, and a small mouth, we need to be able to listen, and we need to be able to see more than we talk, right? So that's why our ears and our eyes should be bigger than our mouth, because we want to be able to listen and pay attention versus, always doing the talking. Because when we're client-centered, it's about the client creating their experience, long as it's within the definition of our policy and procedures, of course, right? Because we can't be client-centered for a client that wants to come in and say, I want to start a Tesla car dealership. That won't fall into our policies and procedures. So then the next thing is, so we can ask, when we're developing a rapport with someone, besides being an effective listener, we want to ask open-ended and closed-ended questions. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with those terms. So open-ended questions are questions that invite dialogue. So they are questions that require more than a one-word answer. So that might be something like, well, what brings you in here today? So that's like a really broad question. So that gives that person that you're speaking with an opportunity to share with you why I'm here today. This is what I'm trying to accomplish, versus, oh, you came by the office. Well, yeah. So closed-end question. So a question that is answered with a yes or no, a very direct, a little simple one-word, sometimes two-word answer. So closed-ended questions are good for when you need very specific information, And open-ended questions are good, not only for building rapport, but for helping you get information, especially when you're collecting someone's history during the intake process. So affirmative statements. Affirmative statements are statements that provide confidence and assurance to individuals when you're working with them. So like, you know, a lot of us in VR, we are working with individuals who may have had like some pretty rocket past, or who have had some traumatic experiences, and they may not necessarily have gotten a lot of positive affirmations through life. So the affirmative statements is an opportunity for us to build up their self-esteem and their confidence. So, you know, by saying something as simple as, it is so great that you showed up for your appointment today. You know, just, you know, giving them that positive feedback, and that encourages them to engage in the process as well. So motivational interviewing, of course, is interviewing that gets the individual to talk about things that they sometimes are challenged with talking about, or that produce contradictory feelings to certain things, you know. So just getting them to open up more and to really sit down and think about, you know, versus, you know, instead of saying, oh, you had a back injury, so you can't drive trucks. Perhaps saying, well, what do you think, you know, with your injury, how do you think driving long distances would work? You know, so it makes them sit down and really start to think about, can I really be a truck driver? Versus you saying, you can't be a truck driver. You know, we can't support that. So that's it for that slide. And then I think now, Jamie, if you want to, we can go over the communication style handout.
Yeah, sure. So everyone should have received an email prior to starting today's presentation. And in that email is a document that says communication style. And this is a document that Onita brought to the presentation. So I think that we're going to look over this quickly because our time is kind of getting away from us. But if we look at this communication style quiz, if everyone would like to, I don't know if you had a chance to fill it out before the presentation, but if you could look at it quickly and maybe fill it out quickly, we can kind of get an idea of what our own communication style is. Is that what you intended, Onita?
Say again?
Is that what you intended for us to complete?
Yeah, just to look at it. It pretty much, the purpose of it is, if you know, look at it, it tells you the types of styles, and just to give the person an idea what type of communication style they may have, so they can think about that when they're interacting with their applicants and consumers. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I see at the bottom there, you total up your numbers.
Yeah, and then on the then there should be a second sheet that has the description of communication styles.
Okay, so whichever column has the most the highest total is pretty much your communication.
That's who you are. That's your style.
Okay, all right.
All right, and if we're ready to move on due to time constraints.
Yeah, does anyone want to share the results? We got a message in the chat.
All right, LaQuita.
We did get a message in the chat from LaQuita. And she's basically telling Onita that she doesn't like to talk about herself, so Onita can answer those questions for her.
And as you can see, I answer Laquita. Oh, I don't know why I went directly to Keith, but Laquita is a doer. If I had to, without even answering the questions, I can tell you. She's a doer. Anita says she's more of a creator.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. You know, this would probably be a great like team building, you know, project, maybe to have at one of your team meetings or something like that, just to kind of share with each other. Of course, we kind of all know how each other are anyway, right? Folks that we work with. But
Yeah.
for us, this is really helpful in how we approach our intake meetings. So thank you, Anita.
No problem. So okay. So I think I've touched on this already, so I won't spend too much time here, but when we talked about gathering information to determine eligibility. And so some of those examples include releases of information for Indian Health Services and other health services, depending on what area you live in and where they seek care, behavioral health records and physicians' offices. And then, of course, if there's not enough information gathered from that, then we would usually refer someone out for an assessment or evaluations. That can include like functional capacity evaluations, an FCE, for individuals with physical issues. Sometimes that could be psychological and educational evaluations. Also always remember written consent. So always make sure, because confidentiality is very important in VR, in the VR process. So we always want to make sure that the applicant is consenting for any information that we can share or receive or anything, and other forms that's specific to your particular program and to the VR process. And so, of course, every case file, every program keeps their case files differently, but case files should include an IPE section, of course, and a section for your application. Training and job seeking section, you know, that's where you may include your case notes, job plans, employment information. And then you have your medical records section or your diagnosis and treatment section. Then your administrative section, so that and that's where you would keep your correspondence and other administrative type information. And then, of course, the financial section, the money section. And then, of course, case noting is one of the most important aspects of case management. It is always, always, always extremely important to document, especially in the event someone decides they want to call the client assistance program for a grievance. It is great to have backup documentation. So always remember to do those case notes and make sure they are maintained. If you use the electronic system like data ops or something, make sure you keep your case notes current. It is always important to have, Laquita always says, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. So it is always important to keep things in writing. Next slide. Okay, so then
Onita, this is Rebecca. I just want to highlight a couple things that have been put in the chat.
Okay.
Keith is asking about the presentation materials, and Keith, those were emailed out to participants. So you should have an email that has that information. If you, for some reason, didn't get it, Jamie has put the link in the box, in the chat box, that shows how to access that, or you can reach out to AIVRTTAC and we can email those again.
Keith, I hope that helps. Oh, Keith found the email, great. So right now, Jamie's gonna come in and go over a referral form, which should have been sent in the email as well as an attachment, just to a quick review of the,
Yeah, so if you open up that blank referral form, when you go to our website, we've got some templates on there. If you don't already have a referral form, you're welcome to take that one and make it your own. If you already have your own referral form, feel free to continue to use what you already use. We were just trying to provide some resources if in case you needed a blank referral form. But basically, I like to ask.
Jamie, this is Rebecca. Before you continue, I just want to point out that Mark Allen stated in the chat box that, excuse me, the key information for case notes is who, what, when, why, how. So thank you, Mark, for pointing that out.
thank you, Mark.
Yes, you're absolutely correct, Mark. And if you'd like to speak on that, we'd love to have you talk more about that. We're kind of running out of time, but I want everyone to be able to contribute.
Well,
to
I look
this
at the case notes
presentation.
is, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Hi,
Yes,
everybody.
sir.
For when I do case notes, it's telling a story. So it's who, what, when, why,
Absolutely. And you want
and how,
that case
so that if
file
anyone were to go,
to tell the story. Yeah. Oh,
Right.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Mark.
so telling the story, so you want to cover all those
I agree.
points.
And what
so
I like
that
to say
if
is,
you were to,
sorry, Mark, we're
That's all right.
having some technical issues. But what I was going to say is, I'd like to say if anyone wants to pick up that file in your office, your supervisor, one of your coworkers, if anyone needs to know what's going on in the file, if you have documented properly, they should be able to pick up exactly where that case is, what's happening, what has transpired, what's next steps, so that it does, like you said, Mark, tell the story.
thank you.
Next slide, please. The second section of this presentation talks about needs assessments. And we basically want to make sure that any needs assessment builds on any current information that you have or any information that you've collected during the intake process. And then you're going to kind of go deeper, into what are some of the challenges, what are some of the goals of the consumer and or the participant. And during this assessment, your primary objective is to identify what the problem is, what the impediment to employment is based on the impairments. And you're going to be looking at what services, that may possibly need to be put in place. So as we go on to the next slide, we're going to talk about what is a comprehensive assessment. So during that intake meeting, you're going to be looking at what are some of the impairments based on the disability. Those impairments will also reflect, what the roadblocks to employment may be. And you're really looking for, first of all, if there's going to be a need for additional assessments. Because sometimes a participant will come to you and not have documentation of a disability, may not have any evaluations on file or anything to provide you assistance in determining, what are some of these issues that need to be addressed. So in this comprehensive assessment, you're looking at what information is going to be needed to write your written rehabilitation plan. You're looking at the individual's personality, their interest, some of their skills, soft skills, hard skills, maybe an educational background, any work experience or any transferable skills. And then also, most importantly, we're looking at medical history, any disability information, or any impediments to employment. Next slide. So when there are no medical diagnoses to determine eligibility, based on the disability diagnosis. You know, what are some of the things we need to look at? So possibly scheduling some necessary assessments or evaluations, and you want to always make sure you have release assigned for that. Also, you're wanting to confirm, you know, like we were talking about earlier in the orientation portion of the intake, you know, you want to make sure that they are willing to go through this process. You know, there are responsibilities for the project, and as you as the VR counselor have responsibilities, there are also responsibilities of the participant, you know, and one of those responsibilities are they going to be willing to participate in evaluation process? I have come to that situation before where the participant did not want to participate in a evaluation process, or did not want to be assessed in any way. So anyway, we're going to use this information to develop the IPE. So you know for sure, you know, that you're going to be able to determine eligibility based on the disability diagnosis, that you have documentation or information to support the disability diagnosis. Next slide, please. So here's a tip. When we're talking about prioritizing your tasks for your case, you know, there's a lot of things that happen that you have to prioritize and put in order. And then some things are more urgent than others. For example, you know, once that application is signed and you're working on a timeline now on determining eligibility, you want to prioritize the next steps in the case. So you want to make sure that if there are additional assessments needed, that you go ahead and get those things lined up and prioritized in order. You know, you may have processes in your office where you have to request a requisition through your admin assistant or your VR technician so that you can get an assessment completed. So these are things that we're looking at coordinating internally in your office. For instance, if there has to be follow-up for additional assessment, like I said, if the admin may have to schedule some of these appointments or notify the participant of the date or time of their assessment, you know, taking into account all the tasks that are linked to the next steps in your case in the needs assessment, you know, these are timely things. And you're kind of the responsible person for that. So you want to make sure that you prioritize and stay on top of any key dates and, you know, not miss any of your deadlines. Next slide. We're going to talk next about service planning. Sorry, I'm catching up with my PowerPoint here. Oh, you know what? Let me go back to that last slide real quick because I want to talk about timeline for services also. Start and end dates of your services, making sure that those are in chronological order. You know, some services overlap, but other services can't start until a prior service ends. So you want to make sure when you are prioritizing the order of things that you look at those start and end dates of those services. Next slide, please. And that goes right into service planning. So making sure that the importance of, you know, you want to make sure that your consumer or the participant is successful. And that lies a lot on you, you know, as a counselor, to establishing specific goals and actions that take place in an order. So the result of setting these goals and processes is that you create an IPE plan that, you know, all of these outputs and outcomes are you can measure those in the participant's success. And you want to talk about service planning being both achievable and measurable. Next slide, please. So when you're preparing the IPE, you know, I like to use something called a wrap. And I know, you know, yes, I come from State VR. It's not a secret. Everybody knows before I joined the AIVRS community. And so we had a process called a wrap, which was a written rehabilitation analysis page. And basically it was like a rough draft of the IPE. So you were looking at the impairments first, and then you were matching services to remove any of the impediments to employment. So that way you more or less had a simple rough draft for putting your IPE in place, or for actually developing the IPE with the consumer. So after you've taken all of that information from the intake, you have applied any documentation that you may have as far as the medical diagnosis or any additional assessments that you have created for this individual. Then you want to look at all of the results of that and start, preparing to write the IPE. So it's important, to take these necessary steps so that your IPE is written in a timely manner and you address any issues that may have caused a delay. So during the IPE, you're going to identify any goods and services that may be a barrier or may assist in removing the barrier, I should say, to employment. And also you're talking about sharing information with the participant at this time about their rights and discussing even more detail about CAP services, any comparable services that Onita had talked about earlier, if they receive benefits of any sort or any services that you can write those into the IPE as a comparable service, and any additional information, so that they can exercise informed choice. I have had situations myself where we put services in place in the IPE, but then when it came time to assessment or provision of services, the individual was not comfortable with the service provider or with the vendor. And you have to make sure at this point that CAP is in place and that their informed choice is being applied to the situation. Next slide. So when we're talking about provision of services, we're talking about providing services based on the IPE in order to address the impediments to employment, like we talked about. And of course, the end result is gainful employment for the individual. So providing services that are equally accessible from the state or offered by AIVRS. You may be working in conjunction with your state VR agencies. So we want to make sure that all services are in place in the IPE. And once the provision of services take place, we know who's responsible for what. So we're wanting to examine the participants' need for any changes. Things change when you're working with an individual. So sometimes there may be, an amendment to the IPE. You want to make sure to stay on top of that to help the participant. Sometimes if we don't have that diagnosis, we're trying to obtain a diagnosis or we're trying to obtain treatment for the impairment. These are things that we have to address. Also, to complete any of the required assessments before we put services in place. Also, there's things like job search assistance, job placement services, on the job supports, things like that, that take place after the assessment and eligibility determination has been made. And you've written these into the IPE. So once, as we were talking about earlier, when you're establishing your service begin and end dates, you want to make sure that those services either are in a chronological order or overlap. And of course, counseling guidance throughout the life of the case. Also, there are things like employment goods or services. You may have to apply services where you're helping the individual purchase work clothing. They may need equipment or supplies or tools for work. These are all things that are considered service provisions. And then of course, we want to document everything. I know y'all probably tired of looking at this document, but I'm gonna tell you, I had it on the wall in my office every day so that when I looked up, that's the first thing I saw. So that I would always keep good case notes. Next slide. Here's a tip when we're talking about assigning and scheduling tasks. So, we're trying to make sure that nothing slips through the cracks. You know, we're going to try to make sure we delegate to individuals so that we meet all of our deadlines. And we also want to track our deadlines. So, you know, if your administrative assistant has to execute a task like sending out notification letters, scheduling appointments, things of that nature, you know, you want to make sure that you have good communication with individuals in your office, especially when you're assigning tasks or asking people to help you with scheduling and things like that. So by delegating and scheduling tasks, keeping track of them, you know, in your Outlook, with appointment scheduling, with your calendar, things like that, so that, you know, that can improve efficiency. And also it gives you a better estimate of what time is needed when you're working with future cases. Next slide, please.
Jamie,
Yes.
excuse me, let me just interject if you don't mind. Just
Sure.
listening to that last slide, I just wanted to also say that sometimes it's good to, no, most times it's good to have deadlines with your applicants and consumers as well. Especially if you're in the process of gathering information to determine eligibility for an applicant, you know, to try to stay within that 60-day window. You know, if a applicant is going to acquire information for you, try to get information from the doctor's office themselves, it's important to say things like, if you can have that information to me by Friday on October such a day, that would be most helpful, because I think people work better, applicants and consumers, with deadlines as well. So I just wanted to interject that. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Anita. I appreciate that. Yes. I feel like I'm talking like really, really fast. So, but I'm trying to make up for time here and cover everything in today's presentation. So if I get to going too fast, you guys just tell me to slow it down. You know, I am from the South, so we kind of tend to talk fast.
Yes, you do.
So anyway, in service planning, you know, let's look at an IPE. We sent you a copy of a blank IPE that you're welcome to make into a form if you want to. I'm sure you all already have an IPE document that you use in your office, but you know, how do you prepare for developing the IPE? So like what I was saying earlier, when I was a VR counselor, I would prepare for the IPE by completing that RAP form. So, you know, I would look at what the impediments to employment were, what were the impairments, how could we remove any roadblocks to employment by putting services in place to address those issues. And that's how you identify, you know, what services are going to take place in the IPE. And you're also going to be looking at your service beginning and end dates, you know, to make sure you stagger them as needed. But most importantly, you're going to be working with the consumer or with the participant in developing this IPE, because you're developing it jointly with them and you want them to be involved in this process as much as they want to be and as much as they can be in putting these services in place. So that's kind of how I approach service planning. But, you know, does anyone want to contribute to the conversation on how they approach writing their IPE?
Hi, it's Heather, and I'm from the Cowlitz Indian Tribe. One thing that I got when I actually went to the AIVRTTAC conference in Arizona was someone shared an IPE worksheet with me. And that thing has done wonders, like being able to, you know, I modified it to fit our program or to fit the needs of what we needed. And instead of just trying to do an IPE right away and be like, okay, so what do you need right here, right now? Like, that's really hard. Like, if you ask me what I needed right now, like to be okay, I couldn't tell you. I'd be like, I don't know, right? So really having that giving them that document to take home to kind of really think about stuff. Okay, so this is where I'm at. I think I could be employed. And that really adds that informed choice and them taking control and it being really individualized. It was, I mean, that document has just changed everything and really given me the like strength I need to support that individual better, because instead of me prompting that individual, like more often than not, like they were able to make their own choices, and that's what we're all about. So
Yes, absolutely. Heather, thank you so much for sharing that with us, because the planning is really where the hard work takes place. I mean, once you have your plan together, then you can type up your form as you need to. But getting, in your mind and getting that feedback from the consumer or from the participant is really where the work is. Does anyone else want to share how they approach writing their IPE? Don't make me start calling on people. I see a bunch of counselors in here today.
This is Anita in New Mexico. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Hi, Anita.
Yes, thank you.
I prepare by just having ongoing dialogue with the individual, and then we talk about different things, looking at barriers, looking at what they feel is important for them and how they think they'll be more successful in overcoming some barriers. So we do a lot of pre-planning through dialogue. And so when we think we have a good plan, and of course, always keeping in mind our deadlines and making sure they're on a schedule and saying, okay, we're going to regroup. We'll think about this. Give me your ideas. So it's a lot of dialogue. And then when we're finally at the point, which, it doesn't take too long, but it gives them the opportunity to go back and think and say, well, maybe that will work, or maybe this will be better for me. Making sure they're keeping up with any other appointments that they need to, because I don't want to put a goal in the plan that's going to hinder them by missing certain key appointments that they have to keep. Maybe they're going through behavioral health, maybe they're going through marriage counseling, or those types of things that they need to be mindful of to make sure their schedules coincide with what we're planning to do in the IPE. So when we get to that good, comfortable point of, okay, this is what we're going to work on, these goals, then we'll finalize the IPE together. So that's how I usually prepare them and myself to hopefully we get a good IPE going, and then we're able to amend as we go, make progress and move along.
Yes, thank you, Anita, for sharing that with us. I love hearing how other counselors address writing the IPE. I remember as a new counselor how I struggled. Oh my gosh, okay, I have all this information. How do I put it in a plan? So I like hearing input from others on how they approach the development of the IPE. Next slide, please. So let's look at tip number 4 on following up with tasks. So when we're working on a case, there are a lot of things that take place, a lot of events, a lot of dates, deadlines, and things like that. So we have to review, we have to go back and look at our previous actions. And then after carrying out some tasks initially, then we have to have a system, to follow up with other parties in our office, vendors, service providers, things like that. So, there are emails, phone calls, things like that. They have to take place, and we have to have a system to follow up with these things and make sure that all of our tasks are completed. So we have to speed up the communication process and making sure that the processes in place are effective. So this communication flow, and it kind of goes back also to Onita's communication style document. How do you communicate within your office with internal communication and external communication? So for instance, if you send an email asking a person to carry out a certain task, by a certain date? Do you book this task yourself, or do you add a reminder to your calendar or to the department's calendar to ask for help getting these things done, you know, so that you can stay on top of things. So making sure that you have tools like, for instance, tools that automatically save information. So like your calendar, for example, on your computer, you know, can you save notes in there? Can you put reminders in there? Can you add flags that notify you when something needs to be done? Putting deadlines into your system, you know, and then of course we document phone calls and emails and things like that in the case once things transpire. But in planning, we need to try to use what resources we have so that we get reminders, so that we stay on top of deadlines and things like that. Next slide, please. So let's move into, we're really running out of time. We're going to move into the last portion of today's presentation, and we're going to talk about monitoring and evaluation. So evaluation is critical to understanding, you know, what impact did you have on this case, or what impact did you have providing services to this particular participant, and were the services effective? You know, what were the outputs and outcomes? Do you have a system of measurement in your office to look at all the steps that took place in this case, and how can you monitor and evaluate your participants' progress? You know, are things taking place like they should? Are things being accomplished? You know, for example, if you put services in place for an individual to receive a certificate of training so that they can reach their employment goal, for instance, if they're going to go to school to be a firefighter, for example, and they have to have firefighter 1, then EMT and firefighter 2 and things like that to be qualified to apply for that position. You know, are you evaluating or monitoring their progress? Did they receive their grades for that semester or for that certification? Does that qualify them to take the test that they need to take? Did they take the test? Did they pass it? If they did they receive their certificate? Now that if they have their certificate, are they eligible to apply for a position with the county or someone? You know what I'm saying? So those are the types of measurements that I'm talking about when you're trying to decide, you know, and monitor the progress of the case. And then also at the end of the case, evaluation is very important as well, because we want to make sure that we keep what we call quantified and qualified evaluation results. Next slide. So when we're monitoring and evaluating, we want to look at employment, you know, or closing the case when they've obtained employment after 90 days. We want to look at case closure and the process for case closure when a case is closed, to successful employment outcomes. And then also there are unsuccessful employment outcomes, and we want to monitor and evaluate that as well. So we want to look at how the provision of services under the IPE contributed to the achievement of the employment goal. We want to talk about how the participant and the counselor determine their employment outcomes, if they were satisfactory, if they were mutually agreed upon, and then reassess if there needs to be post-employment services, and look at possibly amending the IPE as needed, and then making sure that we have all the support documentation in the case file so that we can evaluate that. Next slide, please. And so in accordance with, did we miss a slide? No, sorry, I jumped ahead. So when we talk about post-employment services, we're talking about a case that has been closed successfully after 90 days of employment. And then your participant may have contacted you and said, hey, I need a little more help. So you're looking at adding an amendment to the IPE, but we want to make sure that those services that are added are limited in scope and duration. And so that means that, if it's going to be a service that accomplishes something over a long period of time, it's probably not going to be appropriate for post-employment services. So we want to make sure that we want to limit any services in post-employment services that are going to be achieving new goals, that are going to be over a long-term time span. So best practices are that, you want to provide these post-employment services within 12 months of a successful case closure. And we want to make sure that we do that as efficiently and quickly as possible. Next slide. So in accordance with AIVRS best practices, it states that, you want to make sure that post-employment services are achieved within a minimum of 12 months after 90 days of consecutive employment have been achieved. And you want to make sure that you justify any of the support to maintain, regain, or advance employment that was consistent with the original employment goal, and that the case was successfully closed, and that the services in post-employment, or like I said earlier, are limited in scope and duration. So at the time of the successful closure, you want to inform the participant about the availability and purpose of post-employment, as well as any of their rights and responsibilities. Next slide, please. And then we come to closing a case without successful employment outcome. Unfortunately, this happens. It's not our goal, but it happens. And so we want to make sure that we note that the case was closed without the achievement of an employment outcome during the VR process. And there could be lots of reasons. It may not be of any fault of you as a counselor. It may not be any fault of the participant as a consumer. They may no longer be eligible for whatever reason. Their situation may have improved. They may have declined to accept any additional services. They just may not be available. They may have moved away. I've had participants that passed away during the VR process. And so unfortunately, we had to close it unsuccessfully. There are lots of reasons, but we need to make sure that we communicate with the individual, if possible, about the closure of the case.
So Jamie, we have
Next
a
slide.
question. Jamie, this is
Yes.
Rebecca. We have a question in the chat box. Mark Allen is asking, do you suggest as part of retention follow-up to verification of employment, wages, and income earned from small businesses?
Yes, we do track employment information in the closure documentation. So I would say yes. Are there any project directors on here that would like to address that? Any counselors like to talk about that? I think you probably should have in your office processes documentation for your case file that documents the employment location, the employer, the rate of pay, any benefits that they receive, and make sure that you keep that in the case file at the time of closure. Does anyone want to talk about that?
So one thing that we do, we have a client list. And so where we keep that information, we put it in their note when they get employed, is it full-time, is it part-time? How much is it? And then on our client sheets that we have, it says right there where they were employed, like when are they going to be a 90-day success, and just information like that. So.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Heather. And thank you, Mark. Mary says that for self-employment, we're asked for a copy of the tax return filed. That is great documentation, Mary. Thank you for adding that. Next slide, please.
Well, can I just say something about our clients being incarcerated? We don't automatically close them out if they're incarcerated, because it could be just a few days, it could be a week, could be a month, and they still might be able to be provided services while they're in there. So it's just
Yes,
not an
thank
automatic
you.
closure.
Thanks so much, Laura, for that input. You're absolutely right. It could be a situation where it's just for whatever reason they were picked up, they got back out and they're ready to continue on with their case. But then there may be other circumstances where there are pending, for whatever reason, legal issues involved in that case. You know, we recommend that if you have someone that has pending legal issues, you may want to pause the case, because they may end up pulling jail time over those legal issues. They may lose their license. They may, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So taking that into account. But Laura, you're absolutely correct. I like the idea of giving them the opportunity to reconnect with you before you close them out. That's why it's so important to have these conversations. As we go to the next slide,
Jamie, this is Rebecca again. I just wanted to make mention that there are a number of self-employment resources available, and I will put a link in the chat box to a wonderful website that the University of Montana created for TBR self-employment. And those of you who have clients doing that, you can utilize that website and it will be really helpful. And if others of you have ideas for self-employment resources, because it is difficult at times to measure the success of that, put it in the chat. Feel free to share.
thanks so much, Rebecca.
Jamie, can I ask a
Appreciate
quick
you.
question?
Yes.
Hello, Jamie.
Kind of going in and
Hear me?
out, Mark.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, I'll see if I could talk even louder. When I know we have our participants sign a release form for medical records for employment verification. If we're not able to get from the individual an actual pay stub, that we could request it from the employer.
Mark, I'm not sure if it's my computer or your computer, but I've heard about half of what you asked. I think
you-
what you were asking was, can we request employment documentation from the employer?
Yes, I think that's what he was asking.
Okay.
Right, Mark?
Yes.
So yes, I contacted the employer. The individual has to give you consent to do that. But I had no problem contacting the employer and asking for copies of pay information.
Mark,
But
we
I would like to give the consumer the opportunity to do that themselves.
Mark, our program does have a form that we use for that purpose. And Jamie is writing that the consumer has to sign it, but we have a form that we've developed where the consumer signs it, but we present it directly to the employer to get proof of wages.
Okay, so we are completely out of time. I want to skip ahead to, let's see, the slide. Let's skip about 4 slides up. One more slide. Yeah. So let's wrap this thing up. Let's talk about tracking your caseload. If you use electronic case files, an ECF, it's important to use the report options in your software so that you can print lists of your case, what status they're in, keep an updated list. I used to look at mine every week to see if any of my deadlines changed, if anything else needs to be prioritized in a certain order. If you don't use electronic case files, if you use hard copy files, just create a list or tape or staple a piece of paper on the outside front of your folder. This kind of gives everyone an indication, you know, what status your case is in. Are you waiting to get an application signed? Are you waiting for documentation for eligibility determination? So, you know, if you do use case management software, you can look at different ways to track your caseload using your software, or contact your software representative and ask them about additional training on how to use software for reporting purposes and for case management. So let's go to the next slide.
Jamie, I just wanted to point out there's a couple things in the chat box. Heather Kraft said, in our rights and responsibilities forum, we put incarceration that places client out of the service area for more than 30 days, then they could potentially be closed. And Mark is asking, do we need a special release form for employment verification as with the medical release form? So that's a question you might be able to respond to. And Naomi said, there are 2 of us in our department and we use an Excel spreadsheet to track.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Mark, you would need documentation for the file and release of information in both of those instances. And Naomi, thank you for your response. They use an Excel spreadsheet, which brings us to our current slide. If you, hold on just a second. Next slide, please, Ava. If you want to know more about creating an Excel spreadsheet like Heather just talked about and tracking your caseload, if you want to contact me directly, I can help you with maybe setting up a spreadsheet that helps you track your caseload. We've provided that service to other individuals, other projects, so that they had a simple way of keeping track of their caseload and their deadlines and dates.